The first time the adept hears this mystical sound when meditating, it may be very faint indeed, according to his level of being and ardor. And even if he has heard and recognized it, it may keep disappearing and reappearing every so often. It will, so to speak, play with the aspirant, constantly putting him on trial to test his perseverance, or it may vanish altogether, and the adept will not hear it anymore for some time. He must not be disheartened at this, but persistently look for it again and again until he finally succeeds in hearing it once more. The importance of this nada, this sacred sound, cannot be stressed enough. It could be compared to a divine signpost compassionately indicating the way to a struggling seeker in this difficult quest. Generally, a man's thoughts and feelings are constantly changing. Ever tossed about by the waves of the incessant flux of his thoughts, there is no continuity of being in him, and in his ordinary habitual state he cannot know or even conceive what it truly means to have inner continuity of being. Without any real aim in him, he is like a dried leaf being blown helplessly hither and thither by the ever-changing winds of his inner moods, his thoughts and his desires. And his moods, thoughts and desires are all the time being influenced by external conditions, as well as by all sorts of unseen forces acting upon him. When the adept has recognized this nada and familiarized himself well enough with it, he will perceive that contrary to the ever-changing inner and outer conditions which he was used to up to that moment, this mystical sound has a strange, unearthly continuity about it. In addition to the description of this sound given in the previous chapter, it can also be compared to the soft whisper of the wind and the continuous hissing noise of the ocean waves, with a shrill ultrasound on top of it, composed of all the harmonics in the universe. On higher spheres, this sacred nada will have a strange sort of silvery aspect to it, somewhat similar to the uninterrupted jingling sound of very little pieces of glass, with other smaller, ever more subtle sounds superimposed on it, until finally these finer sounds seem to disappear into infinity. In the beginning, the adept should fix his attention on the part of the sound which is most shrill, and, as explained in the previous chapter, oscillating slightly, somewhat like the twinkling of a star. It will be easier to hear that way. Later, when the aspirant gets more familiar with it, he will begin to hear two or more sounds at the same moment. At first, he may not quite realize or be really sure that he is hearing two sounds simultaneously. However, if at such times he listens carefully, he will note that one of these two sounds is slightly more obvious, whereas the other is a little more high-pitched and more subtle. He should listen carefully to both sounds for a while, until it becomes absolutely clear to him which of these two sounds is the more subtle and highly pitched. It is to this one he must then gently let his attention turn and concentrate on. He must not be tempted to follow the more obvious of these two sounds anymore, even though it will keep intruding and drawing him back to it. If the adept has reached a sufficient degree of enlightenment and is attentive enough in outer life, he will find that, in the same way as when meditating, his attention is at first drawn to the sound which is more evident. So, in the outside world, people without realizing it almost always let themselves be tempted by and attracted to the more obvious aspects of life, whereas the more subtle and finer ones, unfortunately, escape most people most of the time. This applies to everything that people do and to which they have leanings, including the kind of friends to whom they are drawn, the things they ordinarily like, the sort of entertainment to which they are attracted, and so forth. This tendency is equally applicable to their choice in the various arts, which is very revealing of the level of their thinking and being. The subtler and more lofty aspects of art seem always to escape the majority of people. In understanding all this, it should be apparent that if a man is not sufficiently transformed through his spiritual struggles, and has not acquired the necessary inner discernment to deal with this tendency in him while he is still alive, then the same problem will confront him when he leaves this form of existence. He will gravitate blindly to the more obvious states, and the more subtle ones will be lost to him. When using this mystical sound as the basic support for his meditation, the adept should also be very alert and attentive as to where the subtler aspects of this sound are drawing him within himself. He will thus, little by little, gravitate to ever finer states of consciousness and will start to sense an out-of-the-ordinary inner continuity of being which is beyond description and which it is impossible for him to experience in his habitual state. As his meditation deepens, it will bring with it a most subtle, transparent and luminous consciousness, which he will finally become immersed in and one with. He will no longer sense himself in the same way as he did in the past. He will become mysteriously transformed into an unchanging and enigmatic spectator, plunged in the vast silence of an eternal cosmic nowness. As man's feelings and thoughts are generally in a constant state of flux, the mysterious continuity that this mystical sound possesses can, in very truth, carry the aspirant during his spiritual efforts. Especially at the beginning of his struggles, when he will encounter much opposition and difficulty within himself towards meditation, this sacred sound will be a benign blessing for him. It will also be a boon and an extraordinary prop in all his other spiritual practices as well. Through its grace and help, he will gradually begin intuitively to understand and feel where he has to be placed in himself and where, by habit, he never is. But this is not enough, for the adept must now try to listen to this mystical sound in his outer life activities also. He should continuously turn to it, seek it, and with all his sincerity and might endeavor to hear and hold on to it while talking, eating, walking, washing, and so on. Only in this way can the will of the divine begin to manifest itself on the lower planes of being as it already does in the higher spheres. And only in this way can his transformation, as well as the transformation of those with whom he comes into contact, start to take place.